6 million. That is how many private letters the United States federal government opened, read, and destroyed every single year for nearly a century. Not enemy correspondence intercepted during wartime, not criminal communications seized under court order, not the papers of public figures whose correspondence was considered historically significant. Private letters. Letters from fathers to sons who had moved west and stopped writing back. Letters from families in eastern cities to relatives who had been relocated to reservations in territories that had no reliable postal infrastructure. Letters containing money orders representing months of savings sent from immigrants in Pennsylvania coal mines to families waiting in villages in Eastern Europe who would never receive them. Letters from people who were searching for other people. Letters that documented, in the handwriting of ordinary Americans who had no reason to believe anyone other than the intended recipient would ever read them, the full scope of what it meant to be separated from the people you loved in a country too large and too poorly documented to make finding them easy. 6 million of those letters every year, opened by federal employees, read far enough to determine whether they could be redirected, and then, when redirection proved impossible, destroyed. Burned by the cartload, as the law required, as the law had required since 1825, as the law would continue to require for another century and a half. I found this while researching the destruction of the 1890 census, following the pattern of federal record destruction that seemed to concentrate in a single building in Washington across a span of decades that corresponded precisely to the most consequential demographic disruptions in American history. I expected to find a simple story about administrative inefficiency, about the practical problems of managing an overwhelmed postal system in the era before reliable address standardization, about bureaucratic decisions made without malice that happened to result in the loss of historically significant material. What I found instead was a system that had been designed from the beginning to consume its own evidence, that operated for 167 years with the explicit legal authorization of the United States Congress. That documented its own operations in ways specifically calibrated to preserve the institutional reputation of the people who ran it, while ensuring that the content of what they destroyed could never be recovered or accounted for. The official story of the Dead Letter Office is a story of practical necessity and occasional human interest. The postal system needed a mechanism for handling mail that could not be delivered. Without such a mechanism, undeliverable letters would accumulate indefinitely. The Dead Letter Office provided that mechanism. It opened letters. It searched for return addresses or other identifying information that would allow the mail to be redirected. If a letter could be delivered or returned, the office delivered or returned it. If it could not, it was destroyed. The office is remembered today primarily for the museum it maintained in Washington, a collection of the strangest items that had been mailed across the country during its operational period: live animals, perishable foods in various states of decomposition, personal effects of unusual character. The museum attracted visitors and generated favorable newspaper coverage. It made the Dead Letter Office seem like a charming institution, doing its best to manage the eccentricities of a vast and diverse population. That story is not wrong as far as it goes. What it does not go far enough to examine is the scale of what was being destroyed alongside the oddities that ended up in the museum, and the specific categories of correspondence that were most heavily represented in what the office burned. Here is what the operational records reveal when you examine them against the demographic history of the same period. By 1882, the Dead Letter Office was processing 13,600 pieces of undeliverable mail every single day. Not per week, not per month, every day. By 1893, that daily volume had grown to more than 20,000 pieces. By the early years of the 20th century, the office was handling 30,000 pieces of undeliverable mail every single day. More than 11 million items per year passing through a single federal facility in Washington. Each one opened, each one read far enough to determine its contents and assess whether any identifying information could enable delivery. Each one, in the overwhelming majority of cases, destroyed. The clerks who performed this work were not ordinary postal employees. They were specialists, people who had developed what the office called blind reading, the ability to decode addresses so incomplete, so phonetically mangled, so geographically vague that no standard postal process could have handled them. The office documented its blind reading triumphs with genuine institutional pride. A letter addressed only to the largest dealer in old medical books in Boston. A letter addressed to the only President Street in America. A letter addressed to my son who lives out west and drives a red ox and has a railroad that goes by his place. These were puzzles that the office's most skilled employees solved through a combination of geographical knowledge, pattern recognition, and the kind of accumulated intuition that only comes from years of handling the full range of human attempts to communicate across a country that was still figuring out how to name its own places. The puzzles that were solved were celebrated. The solutions were documented. The letters that contained those solutions were burned with everything else. Because the law required the destruction of undeliverable mail regardless of the ingenuity required to make it deliverable. The curiosity and the triumph were preserved. The content was destroyed. Now, here is where it gets strange. The dead letter office did not destroy everything. It maintained the museum. It kept the items it considered interesting enough to display. It preserved what it judged to be worth preserving. The things it chose to preserve were things that made the institution look colorful and capable and engaged with the human comedy of American life. The things it chose to destroy were things that documented the human tragedy of American disconnection. A collection of Civil War soldier photographs accumulated in the office during and after the war. Thousands of portraits that soldiers had commissioned before deployment and sent home to families whose addresses were too imprecise for the postal system to locate. The office mounted these photographs on display boards. It opened the doors to the public. It invited families to come in and look for the faces of fathers and brothers and sons who had not come home, and some of them found what they were looking for. But the letters that had accompanied those photographs, the last words that soldiers had written to families who never received them, those were burned, because the photographs were interesting enough to preserve, and the letters were simply mail that could not be delivered. The distinction the institution drew between what was worth keeping and what was worth burning tells you something precise about what the institution valued. It valued what reflected well on itself. It destroyed what documented the scope of what it had failed to accomplish. Here is what was actually passing through the dead letter office during its century and a half of operation. Between 1850 and 1920, the United States was simultaneously absorbing millions of immigrants from Europe, implementing federal policies that relocated hundreds of thousands of Native Americans from their ancestral territories, dispersing the formerly enslaved population of the South across a continent that had no infrastructure for helping them find each other, and sending hundreds of thousands of men to war twice in a single generation. Every one of these movements produced the same result in the postal system: letters addressed to places people used to be, letters addressed to people who had been assigned new names by the institutions that had processed them, letters addressed to people who were no longer at the address the sender had last known for them, because a court proceeding or an institutional transfer or a forced relocation had moved them somewhere the sender had no way of knowing about. The dead letter office was not simply processing poorly addressed mail. It was processing the documentary residue of the systematic disconnection of American families, and then it was destroying that residue. Every year, by the millions. One surviving envelope tells a story the institution never intended to preserve and that survived only because a clerk misfiled it in an administrative record where it sat undiscovered until a researcher found it decades later. The envelope bears markings in several different colors of ink. Each color represents a different clerk at a different facility who opened the letter, determined it could not be delivered at that address, and forwarded it to the next address. Not at Blackwell's Island, not at the lunatic asylum, not at the infirmary, not at the hospital, not at the almshouse. Someone was trying to reach a person who had been committed to one of the institutional facilities on the islands in New York Harbor. The letter traveled from facility to facility, each one marking it undeliverable, each clerk opening it and reading it far enough to determine that the person it was addressed to was not present at that particular institution. Eventually it reached Washington. Eventually it was scheduled for destruction. It survived because someone filed it in the wrong place. There should be thousands of letters like it in the archive. There is one. Here is what connects all of this to the pattern I kept finding in every investigation I had been conducting simultaneously. The Dead Letter Office operated in the Commerce Department building in Washington. The 1890 census records were stored in the basement of the same building. On January 10, 1921, a fire broke out in that basement. The 1890 census records that were stored outside the fireproof vault were damaged or destroyed. The records from other census years stored inside the vault survived. The investigation never conclusively determined the cause of the fire. The damaged records were warehoused without preservation effort for 12 years. Then, they were destroyed by congressional authorization in February 1933, one day before the National Archives building was dedicated. The institution created to prevent exactly that kind of loss was dedicated the day after Congress authorized the largest single archival destruction in American history. Across the hall from where the census records burned, the Dead Letter Office had been performing its own authorized destruction for nearly a century before the fire arrived. Different mechanisms, different authorizing legislation, different institutional justifications, same result. The documentary record of where Americans were and who they were trying to reach and what they needed to say to each other, reduced systematically and permanently to nothing. Maybe the destruction was simply necessary. Maybe privacy required that undeliverable personal correspondence be destroyed rather than preserved in government archives where future administrators might read it. Maybe the scale of the destruction reflects the genuine administrative necessity of managing 11 million undeliverable items per year rather than any deliberate effort to eliminate evidence of what those items documented. Maybe the concentration of destruction in a single building across a single period is nothing more than the coincidence of a shared location. But I keep returning to what was passing through that office, the letters addressed to people inside the institutions that were separating American families. The letters from parents whose children had been placed on orphan trains and who did not know what state their children were in. The letters from family members trying to locate relatives who had been committed to asylums without notification. The letters from formerly enslaved people trying to find family members who had been sold to different owners before emancipation and had dispersed into a South that kept no records of where they had gone. The letters from immigrants trying to find the relatives who had come over first and then stopped writing. The government opened them. The government read them. The government burned them. 6 million per year for 167 years. And when you go looking for what remains of that century and a half of engagement with the private correspondence of the American population, the National Archives finding aids tell you that one box survives. Miscellaneous records 1897 through 1930. One box from 167 years of operation, 11 million items per year. One box. The letters are gone. The people who wrote them are gone. The institution that burned them operated with congressional authorization in plain sight, according to published procedures, for longer than most nations have existed. And the question of what those 6 million letters per year documented about the systematic disconnection of American families across the most disruptive century in the nation's history is a question that the official history of the postal system has never been required to answer. Because the answer was burned with the letters every year, as the law required. If you want more videos like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel. I'll see you in the next one.